On March 25, 1945, commander of the 3rd U.S. Army, George Patton, quietly passes down some pretty unusual orders to the 4th Armored Division. He ordered a lightning-fast armored strike deep behind enemy lines to liberate Allied prisoners held at the camp named Flag XIII-B, a prisoner of war camp near Hammelburg, Germany. This target lay more than 50 miles inside hostile territory. It was an incredibly dangerous distance for a small armored column to cover without flank support or secure communication lines. To make matters more complicated, military intelligence believed the camp housed Patton's own son-in-law, Lieutenant Colonel John Waters, who had been captured in North Africa 2 years prior. Though there was no definitive confirmation of Waters' presence, Patton didn't care and was determined to find out. This high-risk concept of a captive rescue was not unprecedented in early 1945. Thousands of miles away in the Pacific, General Douglas MacArthur's forces had recently pulled off 4 spectacular, highly publicized POW camp raids in the Philippines. The most famous of these occurred in northern Luzon on February 1st, where a joint force of Army Rangers and local guerrillas liberated over 500 Allied prisoners. The daring rescue dominated the headlines, landing on the front page of the Stars and Stripes. For an intensely competitive commander like Patton, MacArthur's soaring popularity was a direct challenge. Historical reports of the Pacific rescues suggest that Patton remarked he intended to pull off an operation that would make MacArthur look like a piker. This intense rivalry, combined with a deeply personal motive, set the stage for one of the most disastrously planned raids in American military history. When the directive reached the headquarters of the 4th Armored Division, it was met with immediate skepticism and concern. Major General William Hogue and General Manton Eddy both recognized that the division's personnel were thoroughly exhausted. They had spent the previous several days engaged in brutal, non-stop fighting, successfully forcing a crossing over the Rhine River. The task of organizing the rescue force fell to Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, the commander of Combat Command B. Abrams originally selected Lieutenant Colonel Harold Cohen to lead the mission, instructing him to assemble a hand-picked force. However, Cohen was suffering from an incredibly painful medical condition that ultimately made it impossible for him to ride in a tank or lead an active field command. With Cohen sidelined, the responsibility shifted down the chain of command. Abrams needed a highly capable officer who could handle the intense, unpredictable nature of a deep penetration armored drive. The choice landed on Captain Abraham A. Baum, a battle-hardened 24-year-old officer serving with the 10th Armored Infantry Battalion. Baum was a proven combat leader, but he was given less than 24 hours to prepare his men for a mission whose true purpose was kept hidden from him until the very last moment. The unit assigned to Captain Baum was heavily restricted in size by Patton's explicit orders. The general wanted a fast, compact force that could slip through the lines, rather than a massive combat command that might draw major German reinforcements. This restriction ultimately left the task force incredibly vulnerable, striping them of critical combat power. Task Force Baum consisted of the following personnel and equipment: 314 officers and enlisted men, 10 Sherman tanks, 6 M3 Stuart tanks, 27 half-tracks carrying armored infantry, 3 105mm self-propelled assault guns, 8 jeeps, and 1 cargo carrier. The massive tactical flaw in this composition was the complete lack of heavy artillery or dedicated air support. Once Baum's column crossed the front line, they would be entirely out of radio range and completely isolated from friendly forces. Adding to the complexity, Patton's personal aide, Major Alexander Stiller, was attached to the column. It was only at the dynamic start of the mission that Stiller finally revealed the true objective to Baum. They were risking their lives to rescue Patton's son-in-law, John Waters. Baum was furious to discover that over 300 of his men were being sent 50 miles deep into enemy territory to extract a single, highly connected individual. However, bound by military discipline and duty, the young captain chose to press forward. To help you understand why the raid was going to be such a chaotic disaster, I'm going to explain the specific battlefield geography and internal mechanics of the prison camp itself. The Flag was not a standard prison camp at all. The prefix Flag stands for Offizierslager, meaning it was a highly specialized German POW camp designated strictly for holding enemy military officers. Under the rules of the Geneva Convention, captured officers could not be forced to perform manual labor, making these camps highly secure, tightly monitored holding pens designed solely to keep high-value military mines off the battlefield. The physical site of the camp was originally built long before World War II. It started as a massive German Imperial Army training ground in 1895, expanded during World War I, and was weaponized by the Nazi regime in the 1930s as a primary training base for the Wehrmacht's artillery units. Because it was located on a bleak, wind-swept plateau surrounded by dense pine forests and steep valleys, the German military realized it was topographically isolated, making it the perfect, inescapable location to lock away captured Allied leadership. By March 1945, the camp was a sprawling, multi-layered complex divided into completely isolated sub-compounds separated by double-layered, 8-foot-high barbed wire fences topped with razor wire. These fences were overlooked by heavily armed machine gun watchtowers, equipped with powerful searchlights that swept the muddy grounds every few seconds. The internal structures consisted of dozens of bleak, uninsulated wooden and stone barracks that offered almost no protection against the brutal Bavarian winters. What made Oflag a logistical powder keg was its severe and dangerous overcrowding. The camp was originally designed to hold a manageable population of prisoners, but as the German lines collapsed in early 1945, the Nazi High Command began forcefully marching thousands of POWs away from the advancing Eastern and Western fronts, consolidating them deep within the German interior. The camp had become a patchwork of three distinct and highly tense worlds. First was the Serbian compound, which held over 5,000 Yugoslavian and Serbian officers who had been languishing in captivity since the fall of Belgrade in 1941. They were completely malnourished, deeply anti-Nazi, and kept alive largely by the charity of other prisoners. Separate from them was the American Old Guard compound, which housed several hundred American officers captured during the North Africa campaign in 1943. They had spent 2 years turning the camp into a highly disciplined, regimented, self-governing society with established chains of command, secret radios, and an uneasy, predictable truce with the German camp commandant. Finally, there was the Battle of the Bulge compound, a chaotic, miserable influx of over 1,000 raw, traumatized American officers captured just months earlier in December 1944. They were packed into freezing barracks, sleeping on bare floorboards with no blankets, and suffering from severe frostbite, dysentery, and advanced starvation. By late March 1945, conditions inside the camp had degraded into a humanitarian nightmare. The German supply lines were completely shattered, meaning food deliveries to the camp had entirely stopped. Prisoners were surviving on a starvation diet of a single bowl of watery turnip soup per day and a tiny ration of sawdust-laden black bread. The only thing keeping the men alive was the occasional arrival of International Red Cross packages, which the starving German guards frequently intercepted and looted for themselves. Now remember, Patton's intelligence department had absolutely no idea that the true population of the camp had violently exploded to over 1,500 starving Americans and more than 5,000 desperate Serbians. And it goes even deeper than that because General Patton bureaucratically and operationally crippled his own intelligence department to force the mission through. For an audience of seasoned military history enthusiasts, the name Colonel Oscar Koch carries legendary status. As General Patton's G2 intelligence chief throughout the entire European theater, Koch is widely regarded by modern military historians as one of the most brilliant intelligence officers the United States Army ever produced. He was the analytical engine behind Patton's legendary Third Army successes. It was Koch who famously predicted the exact timing and location of the German winter offensive that became the Battle of the Bulge, allowing Patton to execute his historic, lightning-fast tactical pivot to relieve Bastogne. Patton trusted Koch implicitly. Their relationship was built on a foundation of cold, hard, unvarnished facts, except that is when those facts stood in the way of Patton's own family interests. In the critical days leading up to March 26, 1945, Colonel Koch and his G2 staff did their job with a high level of professionalism. They monitored German troop movements, intercepted radio traffic, and immediately noticed a highly dangerous trend developing around the Hammelburg region. Koch's analysts discovered that the area surrounding Flag XIII-B was not a soft, undefended rear echelon zone. Instead, the retreating German forces were consolidating heavily in the Bavarian interior, and a terrifying array of fanatical Waffen-SS units, heavy anti-tank artillery detachments, and mobile assault gun brigades were rapidly moving into the exact sectors Task Force Baum would have to cross. Furthermore, Koch's intelligence indicated that the Allied front line was advancing so rapidly that the camp would naturally be liberated by massive regular armor divisions in just over a week. Armed with this critical data, Colonel Koch went to Patton with an explicit, urgent warning. Do not send a small isolated task force to Hammelburg. Koch laid out the tactical reality in stark terms. He argued that a force of only 300 men and 57 vehicles would be completely exposed deep behind enemy lines without any logistical support, air cover, or fallback options. Koch warned that the mission was mathematically doomed to fail and would only result in the needless slaughter or capture of elite American tankers. What happened next was a masterclass in bureaucratic suppression. Patton, blinded by a frantic desperation to rescue his son-in-law, Lieutenant Colonel John K. Waters, before the shifting front lines endangered him, chose to completely silence his most trusted advisor. For the first time in the entire war, Patton deliberately ignored a direct warning from Koch. Knowing that Koch's official, written intelligence reports would legally block the mission and force General Dwight D. Eisenhower or General Omar Bradley to intervene, Patton orchestrated a ruthless political bypass. He strictly forbade Koch from briefing Captain Abraham Baum or the tactical planning staff of the 4th Armored Division on the actual concentration of German troops near Hammelburg. Patton then went a step further in his deception. He intentionally classified the true size of the camp population as a non-factor and refused to allow Koch's department to run a standard, thorough pre-mission reconnaissance sweep of Flag XIII-B. By completely cutting his own G2 chief out of the loop and ordering the raid to proceed under a cloud of artificial secrecy, Patton ensured that Captain Baum was handed a set of blind operational orders. For an audience that understands military chain of command, this was a profound breach of operational ethics. Patton deliberately crippled his own army's intelligence system, turning a blind eye to the very expert who had won him his greatest victories, all to ensure that a personal family rescue plan wouldn't be stopped by the inconvenient truth of a waiting German meat grinder. At 6 p.m. on March 26, 1945, the operation commenced. To get Task Force Baum through the main German defensive line, a separate combat team from the 4th Armored Division was ordered to punch a hole through the heavily fortified town of Schweinheim. The plan relied on a swift, quiet breakthrough, but this hope vanished immediately. Schweinheim was defended far more fiercely than American intelligence had anticipated. The assault quickly devolved into a brutal, house-to-house infantry battle. Almost immediately, a German anti-tank rocket struck and disabled the lead American Sherman tank, completely blocking the town's primary road. Realizing that a prolonged battle would destroy his element of surprise, Baum drove his jeep directly into the chaotic firefight to assess the situation. He told the supporting captains to keep the German defenders pinned down while he led his column directly through the side streets of the town, bypassing the main roadblocks. By 11:30 p.m., Task Force Baum had successfully broken through the defensive crust and charged east into the dark German night. As the column raced deeper into Germany, they sowed absolute chaos, but they also drew immediate attention. Baum's men destroyed local telephone lines, shot up several moving trains, and destroyed a German convoy of 88mm anti-aircraft guns. However, because they were moving without infantry flank security, every encounter slowed them down. By the time the column approached the outskirts of Hammelburg on the afternoon of March the 27th, the German military had fully mobilized. Task Force Baum ran into a wall of resistance from mobile tank destroyers and local infantry armed with highly effective Panzerfausts, disposable handheld anti-tank weapons. Armor was burning, ammunition was dangerously low, and the column was rapidly unraveling. But with their objective just miles away, Baum refused to halt. Bypassing the heaviest pockets of resistance, his battered force made a final, desperate dash toward the camp. Spotting the compound through the smoke, Baum ordered his remaining men to fight their way to the entrance, where they breached the main gates of XIII-B to reach the prisoners. In the chaos, several American tanks opened fire on the barracks, accidentally hitting Serbian prisoners whom they mistook for Germans in the smoke. To stop the tragic friendly fire, Lieutenant Colonel John Waters, the very man Patton wanted to rescue, volunteered to walk out toward the American lines with a white flag. As he did, a hidden German soldier shot Waters in the hip, seriously wounding him and forcing him to be carried back to the camp's hospital. Though Baum had technically reached his objective, his victory was short-lived. He found nearly 1,500 American officers crowded in the camp, but he only had enough fuel and vehicle space to transport a tiny fraction of them back. When Task Force Baum finally breached the perimeter of XIII-B, they did not find a unified group of grateful Americans waiting to be rescued. Instead, they stumbled into a camp paralyzed by a bitter, psychological civil war between two distinct generations of American prisoners. The long-term residents were the Old Guard, mostly consisted of officers captured 2 years prior during the North Africa campaign in 1943. Having spent years in captivity, they had developed a strict garrison-style survival mechanism. They wore polished boots, strictly saluted senior officers, and maintained a highly organized, predictable routine with their German captors to keep the peace. Conversely, the new guard consisted of a massive wave of fresh prisoners who had just arrived from the Battle of the Bulge in late 1944. These men were severely traumatized, starving, frostbitten, and deeply cynical. A fierce culture clash erupted. The Bulge survivors openly mocked the Old Guard's obsession with military protocol inside a barbed wire cage, viewing them as detached from the brutal reality of the current war, while the North African officers viewed the new arrivals as undisciplined and broken. When Captain Baum arrived and announced he could only transport a fraction of the men, this division turned toxic. The Old Guard leadership, realizing the physical impossibility of a 50-mile march through enemy territory, ordered many officers not to escape and to stay put. The new Guard viewed this as cowardice, causing intense shouting matches and arguments over who would claim the few available seats on the tanks while German artillery closed in. Yet the most chaotic and historically overlooked aspect of the entire raid belonged to the other side of the camp. A completely separate compound housing over 5,000 Serbian, Yugoslav officers who had been languishing there since Germany's 1941 invasion. The Serbians were treated far more brutally by the Germans than the Western Allies were, and they faced severe starvation. Over the years, a deep bond had formed because American officers frequently threw Red Cross ration packages, similar to the rations shown in this footage, over the inner wire to keep the Serbians alive. The fiercely anti-Nazi Serbians deeply respected the Americans for this lifeline. When Task Force Baum's tanks crashed through the gates, German guards in the watchtowers opened fire with machine guns, pinning down the American prisoners. Seeing their benefactors under fire, hundreds of Serbian prisoners did something extraordinary. They flooded out of their barracks and deliberately ran into the crossfire. Using their own bodies as a massive, chaotic human shield, the Serbians positioned themselves between the German machine gun towers and the fleeing Americans. Faced with a sudden, overwhelming mass of thousands of Serbian prisoners flooding the compound, the German guards hesitated to keep firing blindly into the crowds, fearing an uncontrollable riot. This heroic human buffer provided the critical, life-saving seconds that allowed Captain Baum's men to safely link up with the American compound. The situation rapidly deteriorated on the night of March 27th. Captain Baum was faced with a logistical nightmare. He had hundreds of eager, starving prisoners trying to cling to the outside of his tanks, his vehicles were dangerously low on fuel, and his men were utterly exhausted. Recognizing that a massive, slow-moving column of infantry on foot would be easily destroyed, Baum ordered only the high-ranking officers and those who were physically fit to board the vehicles. The remaining prisoners were advised to either march on foot behind the column or stay in the camp to await the main Allied advance. As the retreat began, the German military closed the trap. Elements of the German 251st Infantry Division, supported by local defense forces and mobile armor, completely surrounded the escape routes. Every road leading back to the American lines was heavily blocked. Baum's column was harassed by constant sniper fire and ambush teams that systematically picked off his remaining half-tracks and tanks. By the morning of March 28th, Task Force Baum was completely spent. Out of the original 32 vehicles that had started the mission, only a small handful of operational tanks and half-tracks remained. The force was cornered on a hill near Rusenberg, completely out of ammunition, fuel, and options. Realizing that organized resistance was no longer possible, Captain Baum issued the final, heartbreaking order: every man for himself. He instructed his remaining soldiers to scatter into the nearby forest in small groups, hoping they could slip back to the American lines on foot. The scale of the disaster was devastating. Task Force Baum began the mission with 314 men and 57 vehicles. By the time the fighting was over, 32 men had been killed in action, while 247, including Captain Abraham Baum himself, had been wounded or captured. Only 35 soldiers managed to return to Allied lines. The material losses were just as severe. Every armored vehicle in the task force, including all of its Sherman tanks, Stuart light tanks, and half-tracks, was either destroyed or captured. Captain Baum, severely wounded in the groin during the final breakout attempt, was captured by German forces and sent right back to XIII-B as a prisoner. He was placed in the very same camp hospital where Lieutenant Colonel John Waters was recovering from his wounds. Only 9 days later, on April 6, 1945, the U.S. 14th Armored Division finally liberated XIII in its normal course of advance, freeing both Baum and Waters without the need for a high-risk raid. Patton's controversial gamble had achieved absolutely nothing, costing the lives, health, and freedom of over 300 brave soldiers in a futile attempt to satisfy a personal motive and a bitter rivalry. It's about as total a failure as a mission can be. Patton later gives Baum the Distinguished Service Cross, but Baum never really shakes off the guilt. He took the losses personally for the rest of his life. Eisenhower doesn't even find out about the disaster until after the camp's official liberation, and when he does, he's fuming. Writing to General Marshall on April 15th, he lays out his frustration with Patton, pointing to the pointless side mission that cost a full company of tanks and a platoon of light tanks in exchange for getting back just 25 prisoners, plus the fact that Patton had slapped a press blackout on the whole thing and then forgot to lift it. Patton would later claim the raid was meant purely as a diversion, and that he had no idea Waters was even there. Some historians give that some benefit of the doubt, but Patton's own letters kind of blow that up. In a note to his wife Beatrice on March the 25th, he wrote that they were headed right for John's place, and hoped to send an expedition tomorrow to get John. That's not exactly a diversion. Still, to his credit, Patton eventually owns part of the mistake. In his diary on March 31st, he admits the real error was sending such a small force, and blames it on Bradley pushing back against anything bigger. He even says that if he'd sent a full combat command like he originally wanted, the disaster wouldn't have happened. Less than a week later, after learning of the raid's failure, Patton reflected on the disaster and, at least partially, accepted blame. Patton wrote in his diary on March 31st, "So far, I've only made one mistake, and that was when I lost 2 companies of the 4th Armored Division in making the attack on Hammelburg. I made it with only 2 companies on account of the strenuous objections of General Bradley to making any effort at all. Had I sent a combat command as I had first intended to do, this mistake would not have occurred." To truly understand how deep the geopolitical paranoia ran during the final weeks of the war, we have to look at the bizarre fate of Major Alexander Stiller. Officially, Captain Abraham Baum was the tactical commander of the raid. In reality, Major Stiller was Patton's personal watchdog, political puppet master, and his closest confidant. Stiller had served as Patton's aide-de-camp since the desert campaigns of North Africa. He was sent on the mission for one specific, highly classified reason. He was the only man in the Third Army who personally knew what Patton's son-in-law, John K. Waters, actually looked like. When Task Force Baum was utterly surrounded and annihilated on March 28th, Stiller didn't surrender quietly. He engaged in a fierce, desperate gunfight alongside the remaining raiders, got pinned down in an open field and was ultimately taken prisoner by regular German troops. When the Germans processed Stiller, his capture sent absolute shockwaves through the German high command, triggering what historians call the shock of recognition. Normal American majors didn't carry the kind of highly classified, personal proximity to the Allied Supreme Command that Stiller did. When German intelligence officers pulled his identification, they instantly recognized his name from intercepted Third Army communications. They realized they hadn't just captured an ordinary combat officer, they had captured General George S. Patton's right-hand man. This discovery threw German military intelligence into a state of absolute strategic panic. In late March 1945, Nazi Germany was collapsing on all fronts, and the German military was desperately trying to anticipate where the Allies would strike next. To the German high command, the math of Task Force Baum made absolutely no sense. They refused to believe that the United States military would risk 300 elite soldiers, 50 tanks, and heavily armored half-tracks to drive 50 miles deep behind enemy lines just to liberate a random POW camp. They assumed this human interest explanation was a childish American cover story. Instead, German intelligence firmly believed that Major Stiller was the mastermind behind a massive, highly secretive Allied deception plan. They assumed Task Force Baum was an armored spearhead meant to scout a path for a surprise, massive Third Army flanking maneuver designed to bypass the main German defenses and race straight for Berlin. Because of this shock of recognition, Stiller was immediately separated from the other prisoners, isolated under heavy armed guard, and subjected to intense, aggressive interrogation. The Germans grilled him for hours, demanding to know the true, strategic objective of the raid, what secret weapons Patton was developing, and where the main Allied armored divisions were hiding. Stiller, fiercely loyal to Patton, stuck to the truth. He told them the raid was just a rescue mission, but the irony was profound. The more Stiller insisted that Patton had sent a whole armored column 50 miles into Germany just to break into a prison camp, the more the German interrogators thought he was a highly trained, elite operative successfully holding out under pressure. This intelligence vacuum and paranoia kept German forces diverted and on high alert for days, hunting for a phantom American army that didn't exist, all because they couldn't comprehend that a legendary American general would compromise an entire military operation just to save a member of his own family. The SS and the German camp command mostly viewed the failed raid as a major propaganda victory and a total embarrassment for the Americans. Because Germany was losing the war badly by March 1945, the German propaganda machine, led by Joseph Goebbels, seized on the incident to boost domestic morale, broadcasting the mission on the radio as a disgraceful fiasco. Instead of seeing it as a serious strategic threat, they mocked it as a reckless cowboy operation and a textbook example of American military arrogance. The SS specifically highlighted the fact that Patton had risked, and ultimately lost, an entire armored task force not for any military advantage, but as a personal favor to rescue his own son-in-law. For the Germans, it was the perfect opportunity to show their remaining troops that the Allies were beatable and making sloppy, desperate mistakes. For Patton, it became one of the few decisions that would permanently stain an otherwise brilliant military career. And for the men who followed Captain Baum into Germany, it was a mission from which most would never return. Thanks for watching, guys. Don't forget to subscribe, and let me know down in the comments, what do you think about this story?